Welcome to EMC. In today's presentation, we're going to discuss the AX Workflow Manager. We'll begin by discussing what is workflow. Now, workflow is a term that's used to describe the tasks, procedural steps, and things that an organization might do to get a document through a process. And not just a document. Workflow could apply to any process that happens in the office. For example, a vacation request. That would involve a workflow where maybe the employee makes a request to their manager for a day off. The manager approves that, and then someone needs to notify the HR department that they're taking the day off so that the payroll can be adjusted accordingly. So that would be an example of a workflow that's not necessarily document-centric. With ApplicationXtender Workflow, you can do both paper-centric workflow as well as process-centric workflow. So we'll be able to do both of those, and we'll talk about that more as we get into this presentation. But for most companies, workflow is it's a process where they're automating to ensure that documents are going from one place to the next and that the right people are handling this in the time frame that they need to do the work. So a workflow application can ensure that each person in that process completes their step adequately before it goes to the next step. Now, who needs workflow? Well, virtually any company that has a process that they need to ensure happens the same way every time is an organization that could benefit from workflow software. It's going to enable those processes to be automated in a fashion that things will happen the way they're supposed to every time. Some examples here on the screen are insurance companies. I mean, when you put in an insurance claim, it's usually going through the same process every time. HR departments use a workflow for hiring people. There's always the same steps. Accounting departments have processes for working with the accounts payables and receivables, and management and payroll might have a process for leave requests. So virtually any company that has a process where the work must flow in a pattern from one person to the next could benefit by using workflow software to automate those processes. Now, where does a company begin when they're thinking of adding workflow software to their environment? The first step is to get an idea of what their existing process is. So it's helpful if the organization can draw out their existing process in Visio or PowerPoint or even on paper. Often a company that is not using workflow software has this process and it's moving so well through all their employees that they don't even know all the steps that a document goes through. Each link in the chain of the process may know all the variations that could happen, but having it all on paper in one place to then implement electronically, there's a big gap there. So what I recommend to some companies is that, especially if you have a paper process today, attach a sheet of paper to the top of a document as it goes through the workflow process and get your staff to write on that document every step that happens during that process. If you look at this diagram in the lower left corner here, you can see that there's variations. It's not as simple as this one where the paper might go from one person to the next person to the next person. This one has different options and elements that might cause a document to go one direction or the other. For example, in a payables process, if the dollar amount of the invoice is a large enough amount, it might have to go through upper level approval. So getting the company and getting the organization to draw out their existing process in Visio, PowerPoint, or even on paper is absolutely the starting place to implementing workflow software. Okay, we're going to demonstrate the AX workflow now. We're going to do it in 3 different stages, starting with what an end user might see if they are a participant in an accounts payable workflow process. And we're going to start with the ApplicationXtender Document Manager interface. But a workflow can be triggered through many of our client interfaces. It could come in through Microsoft Word, it could come in through Microsoft Outlook, it could come in through AX Web Access, it could come in from bulk scanning. So any way a document comes into the ApplicationXtender backend can be used to trigger a workflow process. So in our sample workflow on the demo image today, we have it set up that every time a new document is added to the accounts payable container, it actually triggers a workflow. So we're going to manually add a document here. Now our workflow has the ability to examine these index fields, and based on information in these fields, if it's a high dollar amount, for example, it's going to send this invoice for upper level approval because it knows that this amount needs to be approved by a manager. If the purchase order field is empty, the PO number field, it's going to send it to a user to ask them to identify where is the PO and why is it empty. So I'm going to fill in these fields, and I'm going to then click Save, and that has triggered the workflow business process for accounts payable. This invoice is going to then flow through that process. Now while we're on the screen, workflows can be triggered when a document is added to accounts payable, or any of the containers. So a workflow can be triggered when a document is added to AX. A workflow can also be triggered when somebody changes an index field for a document. So simply changing this status field to processed could trigger a workflow. So that's two ways that a workflow can be triggered. A workflow can be triggered by a user actually submitting the document manually. If you've got it set up that way, you can submit to workflow and send it that way. So three different ways that you can trigger a workflow: when a document's added, when an index field is modified or deleted, or manual, where you give the users the rights to submit that document manually. You can also trigger a workflow from another workflow. So there's all these different ways that you can trigger a workflow. So when you're thinking about, will this workflow fit the needs of your business organization, the answer is yes. And what we really need to know from you, if you're one of our customers, is what do you need the workflow to do, because this workflow can work in all those different ways. So I'm going to close this client interface now, because this really isn't workflow. We were just showing you the different ways that a workflow can be triggered. Now we're switching to our workflow client interface. So a workflow task can go to an end user in different ways. It can go to this workflow client interface, which is a web client, so anywhere they have access to intranet or internet browser, they can work on the tasks that are pertain to them, or the task could go to an email system, an email inbox. Now on our demo image here today, we've got it set up that it's going to our workflow client. So a user has logged into this workflow client interface, and the first thing they see are the business processes that they're a member of. So my particular user is only a member of the accounts payable process, but if they were a member of the HR process, the accounts payable, accounts receivable, they would see more than one workflow listed here on the left. Underneath that business process, the user sees an inbox, and any task that's designated as belonging to that user would go to their inbox here, or it could go to their Outlook or other email. So a task will go to their inbox when they need to work on it. Tasks can also go to teams, so it can go to groups of people, because usually when information is flowing through a business process, it goes to a group of people, and there's a team that's working on a particular leg of that journey. So our workflow today is set up with 3 team queues: AP Approver, AP Info, and AP Processor. Now the document that we just submitted to workflow that just came in is automatically in the accounts payable process, and it's sitting here in the AP Processor team queue. It's waiting for someone who is on that team to pick it out of the queue and work on it. In the queue, it depends on the user's rights what they're allowed to do. I just right-click this item. I'm logged on as an administrator, so I can allocate this queue item to a person. I can move it to a different queue if it's in the wrong queue. I can pick it to work on. I could set a plan around it if I want it to happen in a certain time frame. And I could change the priority. So these are options that when you create the queue, you add users to the queue, and then you decide which of these options that they might be allowed to have. Some individuals will only see the pick option to pick it to work on. Some individuals might not see anything. They're only allowed to view the queue. You can have the queue automatically send items to people too. So if this inbox had less than 5 items in it, you could tell the queue to go ahead and send items to that person. So there's all these options available with queue management. For today, we're manually going to pick this item from the queue, and that's going to move it to the end user's inbox for them to work on. So it's telling us the item has been picked and assigned to the actor, and now we can see that it's in their inbox. Now once it's in their inbox, a user is going to click this item to open it and work on it. And what they see when this item opens up is they'll have the document view on the left, they'll have a form in the middle, and this is a simple approve or reject task. So in this case, the user just needs to approve or reject this invoice to move it to the next process. Now this invoice is coming up in a viewer. If the user has the rights to annotate, then they're going to be able to annotate here, but that's all based on their rights in the back-end content management system, so they might not see that if they don't have the rights. You can also add a link here, so if you want to launch this document outside of this window, you could have a hyperlink on this window here at the top that would open this document up outside this window and give the user the ability to add documents to this packet as it travels through the system. In the middle of the screen here, we have a form. And the ApplicationXtender Workflow includes a Forms Builder module that allows you to build the forms that will accompany these documents as they go through the process. So for right now, you're just looking at the standard index fields that came in from the back-end content management system. But generally, when a document's traveling through a workflow, the staff will have to answer or respond to questions that relate to this document, maybe do line item approval on an invoice, or maybe assign a GL account or something like that. So this form, these fields are not necessarily the same as the fields where the document was indexed and stored in the back-end system. They might be forms related specifically to the process itself. So the AX Workflow includes a Forms Builder module, and this form can be customized for every step of the process. You could have it where someone picks a certain approver or a team of approvers, and that automatically causes the workflow to route based on the values in this field too. So we already talked about how when the document comes in, the workflow looks at the index fields from AX, but the workflow will also look at the fields in these forms when it's doing the routing process. So again, I want to reiterate, when you're wondering whether or not our ApplicationXtender Workflow can handle your business needs, the answer to that is yes. And what you need to focus on is what are your needs, because that's usually where the gray area is. But this software can route in many different fashions and handle everything, mimic everything that's in the human world. So for this particular task, the only thing I can do is approve or reject, because this is a simple approve or reject task. So I'm going to approve this document, and I'm going to move it to the next step in the workflow process. Okay, now in this particular workflow, you might recall that I left the PO field blank when I added this document to the system. This workflow that's managing this process in the background is looking at that PO field, and because it's blank, the next step that this workflow document goes through is it goes back to the team queue, but this time it's flagged. Check the AP system because something's wrong. This invoice was approved, but the PO is missing. So I'm going to pick this item to work on it, and that's going to move it back to my inbox. And when I open this item from my inbox, you're going to see that the user is being presented with a different form this time. So that wonderful Forms Builder module that I just spoke of in the previous section is now showing you a different form. So every step of the process that this document goes through, you can have a different customized form. And this form could have a company logo at the top, it could have a link for attaching documents, it can have buttons like this one that go out and check a third-party system to look for this. It can have radio buttons and lists. So the form can be anything that you want it to be or you need it to be. And in this case, it's just asking us where's the PO, and I'm going to say the item was not received, and I'm going to click Finish to move this task, this document, to the next step of the payable process. Now the next step that this document takes in our workflow process is that this particular document, our workflow dictates that it needs to be sent to management for approval. So it's now gone into the management queue, and it's waiting approval because it's such a high dollar amount. So if I pick this item to work on it, it's going to move it to the manager's inbox this time. And when I open this from the manager's inbox, you're going to see that it's back to the original form because this is a pretty simple workflow. So it went back to the original form. It's giving the user an approve or reject task before it moves it to the next step of the process. So this is pretty much what an end user might see in a workflow. The work is automatically delivered either to the team or to their individual inbox inside the workflow or to their email. And from there, there's a lot of controls in place to ensure that that the work flows the way it's supposed to flow and that the user is doing the work that they need to do. So from an end user perspective, things are pretty easy. You just pick the work out of a team queue or you pick it out of your inbox and you take care of work from there. Now we're going to move into the next section of the demo, and this section is going to discuss workflow reporting. Workflow does generate some reports, and you can set up custom reports. So we're going to start with the first and most basic thing that people want to know when working with the workflow is where an item is in the workflow process. And then we'll go into details like, is the process working? Are things being delayed? How do you get an escalation report if things aren't moving like they're supposed to? So this entire next section is on workflow reporting. One of the biggest questions that we get asked with the workflow is, how does a workflow participant or a user in general tell where an item is in the process? So it depends on what that user's role is in the organization. So if you're looking at the slide, we've got two different kinds of users inside a content management system. You have the basic AX content management users, and these are the individuals that are going to be adding documents into the back-end system, searching for documents, displaying documents. Then you have the participants who are part of a workflow process. So you might have a clerk that answers the phone and can give a status about an invoice, but that clerk isn't someone who actually works in the workflow process. The reason I'm bringing this up is that when you implement workflow into an organization, there's two different levels of licensing. You'll have licenses for the basic content management users. You'll also have licenses for the workflow participants. So to be cost efficient here and to use the licenses to their full potential, you wouldn't want to buy a license for that clerk that I just mentioned so that they could just look up the status of an invoice. And you wouldn't want that clerk to have to call someone who's a member of the business process every time they need a status. So here's a simple workaround that a lot of companies do that allow these general content management users to see where a workflow is inside the business process. Now we're back to the AX Desktop or Document Manager client, but this could work with any of the ApplicationXtender clients that display index fields. So you could do this with Microsoft Word, you could do it with Outlook, PowerPoint, SharePoint, any of the ApplicationXtender clients that allow you to see the index fields, which are all of them. So in this case, I'm a user and I'm the clerk that I just spoke of in the previous slide, and someone's called me up and they want to know the status of their invoice in the system. Well, I can query the invoice system, I can query the application, and I could fill out the information pertinent to whoever's on the phone. Maybe it's the computer store or somebody that wants to know the information on their invoice. And when I search and bring up that invoice on the screen, I have a status field here. And it shows me that that particular invoice is still in the new invoice process. It hasn't moved to the next step of the process yet. So this is a simple way to tell where these documents are in the workflow process without purchasing a workflow license for this particular user, because I'm just a clerk in this instance and I'm just someone who's looking for a document, just need to know the status so I can answer the customer on the phone. Now there's another use case for this, and that is, let's say I'm Martha and I come in every morning and I need to see which invoices are processed and waiting to be paid. So I can create a saved query based on that status field, and I just come in and click this, and here's the invoices that are processed and the invoices that need Martha to work on them. So I can see that right away just by clicking that saved query button and bring these invoices up and work with them. So this is two different ways that you might use the default settings inside the ApplicationXtender clients to give users the ability to see where an item is in a workflow process. Now the status field that I'm showing you here, great idea. It saves companies money because they don't have to buy workflow licenses for all their users. And the added benefit is that as this goes through the process, the workflow itself can update the status field automatically. So the workflow can update any of these fields, not just the status field. So if you need the workflow to modify a field and, as I stated in the beginning of this presentation, perhaps trigger another workflow, that can be done with the AX workflow. So this is one form of reporting. Where is that workflow in the system? And this shows you how you might have users be able to see where the documents are in the process just by using a status field or any field inside AX and having the workflow update that field for them. Now we've left the Application Extender client where you might have a user looking for the status of an item that's moving through a workflow, and that user doesn't need to have a workflow license because, again, they might just be a clerk who's answering the phone and checking the status. They're not someone who participates in the process. So I'm leaving that client and I'm coming back over here to the workflow interface because at this point I am a workflow participant and I need to know where the items are inside the workflow business process. So a user who's inside the workflow, if they have the rights, they can come up here to the Enterprise Console link here and they can go to the reporting section if you've given them the rights to view reports. Once they get here, they can see all of the global reports for the entire system, or they can see the reports just as they relate to one particular workflow. In this case, we're looking at the ones for AP Invoice Demo. So on the right here, I have the items that are traveling through that business process right now. So if we expand this plus sign, we can see, we're going to close this just so we have more real estate, we can see every step of the process that that invoice took as I was demonstrating it moving through the workflow process. And this information is very granular. It's collecting data dynamically, so I don't need to run a report, and it's showing every item that document went through, every task that it went through, who did what. It's showing the AP approver here. It would show who it was directed to if we had told the map to collect that information. So it's very granular. You get lots of details on where the item is in the system. Now for some users this is too much information. They don't want to read all those rows. They just want, down and dirty answers. Show me where the item is in the system. If you double click this first item row in the item here, the workflow will actually display a map for you, for the user, and they can see the business process itself that it's flowing through. So in this particular instance, everywhere where you see a green arrow is where the document has traveled. So it started here. Here's the execution start time and end time. It went here where someone approved it. After it was approved, it went down here, and remember it was looking for the purchase order field, and because the purchase order field was blank, it triggered it over here. This task actually displayed the different form to the user, and it went from here, and now it's looking at the invoice amount, and because that invoice was more than $1,000, it's moved down here for approval. And we did approve it, but it's also got to go through the $10,000 level in this process. So a workflow user can very quickly and easily see where something is in the system and see the details about it. Now in some workflows, this is showing every task in our workflow. In some workflows you're going to have over 100 tasks, and it might be too many for a user to follow the little green arrow through 100 tasks. If they click on execution view, it just shows where that particular item went. It doesn't show everything in the map. So it's a little bit more streamlined for them. So this is just some of the reporting and how a user might find out where a document is in the system at any given time if they're a workflow user. In the next section we're going to go into administrative reports, and in this section we'll discuss some of the things that possibly an administrator might want to know about the workflow business process, like how many invoices have been approved, how many have been rejected, are there any invoices that have been escalated because they weren't processed in the time frame that they needed to be processed. Is the business process working correctly for our organization, and is the staff working properly in the business process? So administrative reports can tell you a lot of these details, and that's what we're going to show you now. Now, one of the many reports that's available to an administrator in the system is, if we click this little plus sign here to expand, is an overdue analysis. An overdue analysis is going to show what might be overdue in the system. Obviously, that's why it's called an overdue analysis, and it gives an administrator a quick and easy view over what's going on in the system. This information is collected dynamically, so I don't need to run a report. The system is creating these views of these reports based on information that's already in the database tables. So this is also done in HTML format, so if I wanted to, I could right-click this item and I could save this picture and email it and put this information into a PowerPoint and run to a meeting. So this is one of the reports in overdue analysis. Now, the workflow also allows administrators to set up key performance indicators. So any of the fields or any of the information that you're working with as a document is traveling through a workflow can be used to create a key performance indicator report. So our report today is called Invoice Breakdown, and it's just giving us a complete status of the invoices. How many were approved, how many were rejected, how many are less than 1,000, how many are greater than 10,000. So in the front row here, you have the actual details, how many invoices were approved. In the back row, you've got thresholds. And what a threshold does for the workflow is, once you set up a threshold in the system, let's say we've got all these invoices under 1,000, or we've got invoices approved at 4. The minute it passes invoice approved at 5, the workflow can send out notifications. So if you need to know, wait a minute, something's going wrong, something's late, the workflow can automatically generate notifications based on these thresholds here. So you can display these reports in bar charts, you can display them in pie charts. Here's the index of what's going on in this pie chart. You can do trend analysis. What these reports do for you is not only give you the information you need instantly, but they also can be visual indicators that perhaps something's wrong in the process. This is a spike on invoice approved, but if this were a spike on invoices that are pending, then you might want to find out why those invoices are sitting in the system and not moving anywhere. And the workflow reporting is pretty intelligent. If I go to this peak here and I click it, it will actually take me to the items that relate to the workflow reporting category that they're in. So you can see very quickly what's going on in the system. On the left here, I've got workflow statuses, so it's showing me the workflows that are running through. We've got workflow instances, what's going on right now in the system. You can also analyze the detail in here. So we've got activity details. I can see that it went through the financial manager activity and approval, and then things are awaiting work and things are completed and moved on. So it's capturing very, very, very granular information that can be used to evaluate the business and oversee the business. So the workflow will capture this information automatically, and you'll see later on in this presentation where you can actually create workflows that read this information and send out notifications. So these are some of the reports that are available here. You've got an escalation report, and I don't have anything in my escalation report right now, but actually I might have something in here, so let's do a search here and find out. So I do have items in here. So these are items that they had, for demo purposes, I set my timeout to 1 second. So these items needed to be processed in 1 second, and they weren't processed in 1 second. So they ended up on my escalation report. Now, how might this be used? Well, a good example of this is not just in accounts payable, but let's say in the mortgage industry. When you put a contract on a home in most states, once that contract is in place, you only have so many days to hire an inspector and get an inspector to go out and inspect the property. And I happen to live in Maryland, so the inspection time here is 7 days. In 7 days from the time the contract is put on a place, there must be an inspection report delivered to the mortgage company that's going to handle the process. So if that doesn't happen in 7 days, then the whole deal falls through the contract. So if you had a workflow in place that perhaps had a timeout on it of 3 days, then once a contract is put in the system, if the inspection report wasn't there in 3 days, it could end up on an escalation report, and it could send out notifications to the next person in the chain, and that might cause someone who's processing that mortgage to call the prospective homeowner and say, have you got the inspection done yet? What's the holdup? You're going to run out of time, and act appropriately. So an escalation report's pretty beneficial, not just for accounts payable, but for other workflow processes as well. This link here for My Activities, it's showing all the activities related to the logged on user, so they can see all the items that they've worked on and what's going through in the system. And then down here we've got the things that are executing, things that are awaiting. Another benefit of these reports is if I go here to awaiting and I see a whole row of things that are awaiting, and I see that they're stuck, they're hung up here at this person's desk, I might want to go look at that and see whether or not is that individual that is holding up this work, are they on vacation? Should I have automatically forwarded the work to another person in the workflow? Are they out sick? What's going on? So awaiting is going to give you an idea of what's going on in the system, what's stuck in the system. These reports are, again, very valuable to the administrator, and all this information is collected dynamically. You don't need to do anything to make these happen, except for if you want to set up key performance indicators, you set those up. So it's all that an administrator could ask for in these reports and more. And this details on the screen, by the way, can also be exported out, and you've got many different ways to share this information. So I'm going to maximize my screen here and scoot this over so you can see some of the ways that you can use this information and save it out in the system. So let's bring that over here. In the lower right corner of the reporting window, you've got some icons that if I click this one for exporting information, I can export the reports in HTML, PDF, XML, Excel, TIFF, RTF text. I can switch it from portrait to landscape. So there's all these options for generating this information out of the workflow that you can then later use in other reports. Okay, in the first section of this presentation, we went through what an end user might see when working in a workflow business process. Then we went over to the administrator side and showed the tools that might be used for an administrator to gather reports and information about their business process. In this next section, we're going to put on the hat of a workflow developer. So this would be the person who's actually going into the back end of the software and using the user-friendly GUI to create a workflow business process. So we're going to show you some of the tools that are available to a workflow developer. So before you can actually have a workflow process attached to your documents or tasks and automatically running the business, you need to build the actual map inside the WorkflowManager software. So ApplicationXtender WorkflowManager includes in the web interface a section for building the workflows. And once you go to this section, you'll see that you can build an ApplicationXtender workflow. This is a workflow that's attached to a document in AX, like we've been demonstrating in this previous presentation. You can also build a workflow that has nothing to do with ApplicationXtender documents. And this is huge because it means that this workflow can work with AX and without AX. So what do I mean, without AX? You might have a company that has a need to automate a business process like a vacation request. And in that case, an employee may go to a web page, fill out a form, ask for a day off, and when they click submit, the form can automatically be sent to their manager for approval, and the manager can then approve it, and if it's attached to a workflow, the workflow can notify payroll, and the workflow can either send an email back accepting or rejecting the employee's request. So this is a process that really doesn't have anything to do with document flow. It's more of just a form. So ApplicationXtender Workflow gives people the ability, or gives organizations the ability, to create a workflow that's document-centric, but also create workflows that aren't document-centric. We've got other buttons here. You can create a business activity monitoring workflow, And that would be a workflow that's just monitoring the overall process. I mean, perhaps they have a workflow process in place, but based on that process, they want another workflow to generate reports about how the process is working. Are things getting behind, collecting data about that process? Well, that's what a business activity monitoring workflow would be. You can also have a workflow that's watching a file directory or a folder, and when something is changed in that directory or folder, it can trigger a workflow. So there's many different types of workflow that this software will do. Now, we're not going to go into all of them in today's presentation. We just need you to know that they're available, and if you want more information about these workflows, then I recommend you either reach out to your EMC contact and for more information, or I'll talk about training at the end of this presentation, where you can get training for our ApplicationXtender workflow. So let's go take a look at the tools and what's available for you as a developer if you're going to create your own workflow process. Now, today's demonstration is just an introduction into these tools. As I've already stated, if you want more information about building a workflow business process in ApplicationXtender WorkflowManager, you would want to attend the EMC training that's available on this product. And I'll give you training resources at the end of this presentation. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the existing workflow map that I've been using during this demo process, and it's currently published, so it's being used by the system. I'm going to unpublish it so that I can edit it. When you go to unpublish, the Workflow Manager gives you the option of killing the current tasks running through the system. If this were just a map that I was practicing with, then I might kill those tasks. If this is a map that's running in production, I'm probably going to pause those tasks because I don't want to interrupt the business while I'm modifying the map. Now, depends on how you're modifying the map too, whether or not you want to pause those tasks. If you're making a major change, adding an entire other section to the business process, then you don't want to just restart existing tasks and have them go the wrong direction. So the changes you make to the map would determine which choice you make there, kill or pause. My map is now in draft status, and I'm able to open it up in the designer so that I can make some design changes to it. Now, in the design window, what you see is the existing map. And on the left here, you see all the available activities that come out of the box with the workflow software. The idea here was that often you use the same tasks again and again and again across different business processes. You know, you're going to have an approval task. You might have a checklist. You might have a task where an administrator just needs to get information and they're not really acting in the map or as part of the business process. So on the left here, these are all of the pre-built out-of-the-box activities that you can use to create your business process inside the Workflow Manager software. Now, each one of these tasks has a set of properties attached to it that you can configure. So for example, we're going to take this approval task and we'll drag it to the map. And if I want this to be in this location on the map, I'll hover over that icon, I'll let go, and now the approval task is here. So after someone checks the purchase order, it might go this direction for approval. Now, the Workflow Manager is smart enough to know that this is an approval task and I haven't designated who's approving it. So that's why you see the exclamation point here. What a workflow developer would do is they would then right-click this and go to Activity Properties. And these are all the properties that you can configure just for that one task. Each of these items have their own individual set of properties that apply to that particular item. So if I scroll down, you can see that you can change the name, give it a description, control how it's displayed to the user. Here it's waiting for me to assign this approval task to either an actor or to a team of people. So an individual or a team. I'm going to select a team. So I'll click that. I'm going to choose the AP Info team, click Assign. And then when I scroll down, you can see that the AP Info team is the one listed there. Now, some of the other properties that you can configure on these tasks, and I said they're all different for each of the tasks, but some of the other ones that you can configure would be the ability to reassign this task to another individual, the ability to ignore unavailable actors. And what that means is the workflow has a calendar running in the background. If staff members in your office are out of the office, You could have the workflow route to a different person instead. You can designate whether or not they're even allowed to pick an alternate actor. Subject and body are some of the fields that you saw in the reporting. When you fill in that information, it captures information that shows in the reporting. Down on the bottom here, you can send out notification emails if things don't happen in a timely fashion. You can redirect to a different URL if you want. Here's the calendar properties. So there's all kinds of granular settings that you can do on each one of these tasks in the map. The fantastic thing about this workflow software is that it's got something for everybody in it. It is a week-long training class for you to attend the training class to learn how to build these, but I think that it's safe to say that this workflow will do any business process that a company wants to perform. So on the left here, let's look at some of these tasks. These are the human activities. So these are the most common used activities that a human being might need to do while working in a business process. They might need to approve a task. They might have a checklist that they need to check off. They might need to make a choice, or maybe they're a manager who just gets information about a task and doesn't do anything else. Invoke form. Maybe something in the task requires a different form to be shown to the users, like the check PO form. So these are some of the out-of-the-box human activities. We have out-of-the-box integration activities. So if you want the workflow to integrate with a third-party system, these are some of the activities that you could put on a map to perform that integration. Maybe you want a script, maybe you want an SOA execute, something to change the workflow status. So this will integrate with many other software applications. You've got engine activities. If you're a developer, then you understand what these are. This would be, maybe you need the map to make a decision. Maybe you need it to loop through the same activity 10 times. It's going down a mailing list or something like that. That's when these tasks would be used. Scheduler activities. So you can put a timer on one activity on the map, but you could also put a timer on an entire section of the map. So example of this might be something like a mortgage processing application. In the mortgage process, things have to happen in a certain time frame, and things need to come back from multiple parties. So you might have an entire section of the map that needs to happen in 5 days, 7 days, or 30 days, and if it doesn't happen, then you want a timer to go off and you want it to automatically notify somebody that the activity didn't happen. So that's what those would be used for. Communications activities are, I think they're cool. The workflow can send out an email. It can send out a notification. It can send out a message through a phone. It can wait for an email, and it can wait for an SMS message. So use case for this might be, we have an insurance company, and when someone gets in an automobile accident, they submit a claim online for their accident. If their premium is not paid, the workflow checks and finds out whether or not their premium's up to date. If their premium's not up to date, the workflow is paused and it sends an email to that person saying, you know, we got your claim, we noticed your premium isn't up to date. It also waits for that email to return before continuing the workflow again. So the communication tools are pretty neat in here. Custom activities is an area of the workflow software where you can actually add activities. So if I've got this same task and I create it over and over and over again, or I need it over and over again in 5 or 6 different maps, then I might want to save that as a custom activity so that I don't have to keep doing those settings over and over again. So you'd save that one in a custom activity. We have BizTalk activities. If you need to integrate with BizTalk, it's another third-party application, you can do that. BPMN elements. These are elements that come from Visio. And someone could create a map in Visio and then import the map into this workflow software and then just enable it. Or they could create it using these BPM elements and then export it out to Visio if they wanted to. List activities. These are if you want the workflow to use a list or collect a list. So an example of this might be, you've got a website, and there's a form on the website that says, for more information, please enter your name and address and contact information. When an outside public individual enters that information, the workflow could collect that information into a list as well as mail back the materials that the person wants. That list can then be used for marketing purposes later. So there's all kinds of things that you can do with list activities. Security would give you some settings for modifying the security of the workflow. SharePoint activities would be if you wanted this workflow to integrate with SharePoint. These are some of the SharePoint activities that you have available. Wizards is a section of the Workflow Manager that gives you some wizards for performing tasks. Perhaps you didn't know how to set up an approval task. You could go here and follow the wizard. Or if you needed more information on SharePoint, you could follow the wizard and set up your SharePoint item. SAP activities would be if you want this workflow to integrate with SAP. You can use some of the SAP activities. We also have the AppExtender activities here. So as the business process is happening, you could have it add a new page to an AX document. You could have it attach documents. You could have it publish information, XML information, wait for an AX document. So these are all the things that this workflow business process could do inside the back-end content repository. And then other actions would be a section again where you get to create other actions or add actions that you want to the workflow business process. So it's a very robust software and very flexible and extensible to do most of what you need it to do. I'm going to delete this activity because I don't want to ruin my map, and I'm going to publish this map back out again, and I'm going to tell it to resume the tasks. So that was a brief overview into what the development side of the workflow looks like.